back, everyone, to Till or Not to Till series by Agricology. My name's Wallace, as I think I've said previously in the series, and here to carry out what is either going to be the last or the second last of the series. We're not fully sure if there's going to be one more. Today is going to be sort of focusing on tillage within organic systems, and our guest today is very well versed in that, and going to help us through that topic today. That guest, I'm sure some of you have heard of, and some of you might not have, which will be just as fun as well. And that is John Pawsey. John, would you like to say hello?
Hello. Yes, very good to speak to you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. How are you getting on? And we're filming this in this beautiful mid-March weather. How are you getting on with the weather?
Well, I mean, we've got about 500 hectares of spring drilling to do. And, this recent weather we've had with the sun shining, and last week was, sort of temperatures up to sort of 18, 19 degrees. It's been absolutely fantastic. So we've been hugely blessed with the weather.
I mean, positively tropical at that stage when we're hitting high teens, to be honest. Especially coming from myself as a very untanned Scotsman with ginger beard. It's almost too much at times, but I would never complain.
No, I agree. I also have very fair skin, so and also very little hair on top of my head. So I've got to the stage now where I can actually just put some sun cream on the top, and it doesn't look too bad.
We won't get into my mistake in Brazil without using sun cream, but it was a not fun time, shall we say. You sort of touched on a bit of the size of the farm there, John, but just for those listening, for those that maybe don't know your sort of story, could you just give us a wee bit of background to the farm and also to yourself?
Yeah, so the farm is just south of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, about 8 miles south of Bury. My own farm, the family farm, is about 700 hectares. And then we farm about another 850 hectares for neighbouring farmers, all within a 7 mile radius of the farm. We converted our own farm to organic production in 1999. So pretty much 25 years ago. And then we converted our contract farms as well because they'd seen what we'd done. We were able to give them some, the financials to see, what sort of kind of returns we were making, and they converted a bit later on than us, which was really great, to be honest. And we're a mixed farm as well. We've got sheep on the farm. We did have this is a very recent thing, but we did have about 1,000 used, but we've actually just really, in the last 2 weeks, reduced that to 200. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And most of them are to do with our soil type and actually probably too many sheep and rotating the round and arable rotation. But anyway, yeah, so I took over from my maternal grandfather in 1985. So, and I turned 60 this year. So I feel like I've been doing it for quite a long time.
Happy birthday for whenever it was. See, looking at the sort of contract farming side, John, it comes with a lot of complexities, I'm sure. But when did you take that on? You turned the home farm organic just before the turn of millennium. How long has
Yeah.
contracting been part of that business model?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's probably we were probably contracting probably, within sort of 10 years before that, I suppose, maybe 7 years before that. But the contracting was just really to as a diversification, as was the organic conversion, to be quite honest. Both
Mhm.
things were trying to diversify. The contracting was obviously trying to spread our fixed costs as much as we could. And the organic farming bit was really, we just weren't making any money out of conventional farming in those days. So both of them were sort of diversification attempts anyway.
In 1999, was organic production in its infancy, or had it sort of kicked off by then?
No, no. I mean, I was, always have been sort of riding on the shoulders of giants. There've been plenty of people before that who developed the organic marketplace, and people like Helen Browning from the Soil Association, people like Lawrence Woodward, a lot of people there who, pioneered this stuff. And really, we came along when it was all sorted, and the then DEFRA minister, if it was called DEFRA then, launched the Organic Farmer Scheme in 1999, and they had they had a budget of 10 million. Everyone was thinking, what are we going to do when wheat was 75 pounds a ton and oilseed rape was 115 pounds a ton? So a lot of people did convert at that time. It came along in 2 years. What was he called? He was called Elliot, the farm minister. But anyway, yeah, we converted at that time, but the market was already pretty developed and growing. And people were going around looking for organic combinable crops. So it was seen as a real opportunity.
And that 75 and 115 for wheat and OSR, what was that in an organic crop?
Well, that's an interesting question. So there wasn't a market for organic oilseed rape, but for organic wheat, I had this friend of mine. Well, he became a friend, but somebody told me about this guy called Ben Pole, and he farmed about 5 miles west from me. And Ben had been organic since the 70s, and he'd been doing it for a long time. So I went and saw Ben, and we had a long chat. I really liked him. Um, his farm looked amazing. But he was able to give me the sort of kind of yields that I would expect, and also the kind of price that I would expect as well. And in those days, organic wheat was, he reckoned, on about 160 pounds a ton compared to 75. And of course, the yields are lower, but you've got no input costs at all. And I was doing all the spraying on the farm and all the fertilizer spreading. So I was at the front line of doing all this stuff, and we just weren't making any money out of it. And I saw it as a lose-lose situation because we weren't making any money. And also I felt very worried about the loss of biodiversity on the farm at the same time. So, conversion to organic, making more money, and nature started to recover, a win-win.
Yeah, it's hard to find a negative in that. It really is. Regarding the sort of approach you have on the farm, John, to the organic production, what role is tillage playing in that? And it's interesting why 26 years on have you chosen to maintain tillage?
So before we converted, we didn't plough anything. It was all minimum tillage. And when we first converted, actually, we attempted a very minimum tillage organic rotation. But actually, we started building up a few weed problems. And I came to realize that when you're bringing complexity into a system like an organic system, so that no one thing dominates, that's our philosophy. So it's got to be diversity in everything. It's diversity in drilling data, it's diversity in crops, it's diversity in that rotation, but also there's got to be a diversity in tillage, because the difficulty is, without being able to use any pesticides, and especially herbicides, if you keep on doing the same thing year in, year out, i.e., plough every year, or min-till every year, or direct drill every year, what you're doing is you're selecting problems. If you keep on doing the same thing, something that likes what you do, what you do, will dominate. So in a no-till system, sterile brome's a massive problem, because it just likes being left on the surface undisturbed, and that's where it does best. Things like, creeping thistle and docks, to a certain extent, we have to do more tillage to get rid of those in our organic rotation. But my philosophy really is very much looking at a field in any one year and deciding what is the best thing that I could do in terms of maintaining soil health, but also dealing with any weed species that we have to deal with, and thinking about the kind of crop we're going to be growing, and make a decision based on those. There's lots of other things as well, but they're the major things that I would focus on before doing anything in a field. So we are ploughing once in the rotation, possibly even twice. But if you think about on a 6-year rotation where we've got 2 years fertility building where we're doing no tillage at all, we've got 2 years in there when we're just min-tilling and using cover crops. And then we've got 1, if not 2 years ploughing, usually one. Actually, we're not doing a massive amount of tillage, to be honest, although we are tilling.
I think it's balance across everything, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's such a boring word because it's
Well, it
it's
is, it
complete
is. And
price.
also the other thing is that we need to make a profit. And I was involved in a project that was set up it was at Otley, but it was certainly, when I was involved, it was with the Arrow Group TAG, which then joined NIAB. But there was a thing called the STAR Project, and the STAR Project looked at every single year. It did a plough-based trial, a min-till based trial, and a direct drill based trial. And then they had this other section that was called a managed trial. And the managed trial, so every other bit got the same thing every single year. And the managed trial was a farmer going into that trial plot and deciding in that year what was the best thing that they could do based on what had happened the previous year or previous years. And when you looked at the figures, and it's still going, that project, and I don't know if this is still true, but when I was involved, the managed approach always gave the best margin. So,
Okay.
I just think that's also important. We've got to do the thing that will keep on top of all this stuff that I talked about, the three areas I talked about before. But at the end of the day, it's got to deliver a profitable margin.
Yeah, it's hard to be green when you're in the red.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. Well, it's not as simple as that, but the baseline's as simple as that. You mentioned a few weed examples there that jump up, John. Is there any sort of challenges in the pest and disease world?
Of course, when you're using no pesticides, that everything's a challenge. But again, my philosophy is that it's we're designing a system where no one thing dominates. So, in a winter crop, we will get some black grass, but then the next crop that goes in will be a spring crop where we don't have any black grass, and then we'll go back to a winter crop, and then we'll go back into a spring crop generally. And then we've got the reset button, which is our ley, where we can really manage some of those weed species that are more difficult to manage in the arable section of the rotation. So, we will have a period where we will build up a problem of something, and then we'll have to address it, like creeping thistle, like the odd dock. Ryegrass at the moment has become a bit of a problem because we are not ploughing after our leys. We are just min-tilling our leys. So we've developed a bit of a ryegrass problem, which we're now getting over. And in terms of disease, that's about bringing more complexity into your rotation and also having lots and lots of different crops in our rotation. So as many different crops as possible. So if one crop does badly, then we've still got a whole load of others to rely on. In terms of pests, the two things that I would say that we do have a problem with, but we're actually having another go this year, is gout fly and spring wheat. Don't know why that is. I think maybe our fields are quite small, and so we've got a lot of margins and hedgerows that the fly might favour, I suppose. But we're growing some spring wheat this year because we haven't grown it for 4 or 5 years, and generally we've built up a lot of beneficial insects, and so usually we don't have a problem with pests. Yeah, I would also say, because of the amount of oilseed rape that's grown around here, it is quite difficult to grow an organic crop of oilseed rape because of flea beetle. But we have grown a successful crop. So yeah, it's about bringing complexity, and so not letting one problem dominate, and that's weeds, pests, and diseases.
Well, I mean, we've seen issues with the flea beetle and conventional almost decimating the crop nationally.
Yes.
So to grow a successful organic crop is pretty impressive. Um,
Yeah.
John, you mentioned, and this I'm not just saying this because I'm a sheep farmer, I promise. You mentioned the sort of transition from 1,000 to 200 sheep. Looking at the rotation with a particular focus on fertilizer more than sort of pesticides, obviously. What differences do you think you're going to see there without the sheep?
But basically, with 1,000 ewes, they were rotated around the farm on sort of 200-hectare blocks, slightly less than that, maybe 160-hectare blocks. And we had very little permanent pasture, literally sort of about 50 hectares of permanent pasture, which was fenced, but the rest of it was just, electric fencing, taking around mobile bowsers and giving them water. And then, of course, we had cover crops before our spring crops, so they were grazed as well. The difficulty we had, and this, I'm going to put the blame really on my shoulders for this, because the difficulty on a soil that's sort of 45% clay is that, and you're grazing leys that, even though in the second year there's quite a bit of substance to them, in the first year they can be quite tender, and even getting into the second year, you've got to be very careful with them. So it means that when you're grazing, you've got to be moving those sheep on regularly and back fencing them so they don't go back over the ground that they've been on. And especially if you're grazing cover crops over the winter, because you can do some proper damage to your soils if you don't keep on doing that. And what actually happened was our shepherd was spending 70% of his time fencing. and 30% of his time making sure that the flock were doing what they were supposed to be doing in terms of how we were developing the genetics, health wise, all those other things. It suddenly, the amount of labor we needed to do it really properly, suddenly I began to realize that it was turning a relatively profitable enterprise into something that wouldn't be profitable. And also we have to really focus on the health and welfare of our shepherd as well. And it turned into quite a punishing job. Um, so the other thing I went and looked at was compared to one of our contract farms, which is right next door to mine, same rotation, same crops being grown. The only difference was they had 1 year fertility building straight with legumes, then going into a 4 year cropped situation. We had 2 years worth of leys going into a 4 year crop. So we had a longer rotation, more fertility building. So I assumed that we were going to be yielding more than my next door neighbor was, which we farmed because of more fertility building. And after 10 years of sheep on the farm, I did an analysis of actually how we'd done. And I assumed actually that maybe the first year we were going to yield about the same, because the problem with the sheep is they want more grass, and then the carbon nitrogen ratio of trying to get all that stuff broken down, especially if you're not ploughing, meant that our crops looked a little bit hungry to start off with. Our first wheats, which was usually a heritage wheat or a spelt crop, because it was breaking down all this sort of ligneous stuff. And actually, but then I thought the second cereal would generally yield more. But in reality, when I looked at the figures, we yielded 0.5 ton a hectare less in both those situations, the first wheat and second wheat situations, or second cereal situation. So it put quite a different perspective on the sheep enterprise. And I think basically we probably had too many sheep. If I was a farm that had, say, a third of the farm in a permanent pasture and 2/3 was cropped, we could have rested that land much more effectively than we were. And I think I probably got it wrong. So what we've done is we've reduced the flock from 1,000 to 200. They literally gone in the last 2 weeks. We're going to put them on our permanent pastures, use them much more opportunistically in a lighter way on our crops and our cover crops and our leys, and possibly build the numbers up and sort of start the thing all over again, possibly. At the moment, we're quite enjoying not having 1,000 sheep on the farm, because I know, you being a sheep farmer, is that out of all the enterprises on the farm, the thing that takes up most of the thinking time, most of the stress, actually is the sheep. And I love them, but I'm quite looking forward to a year with less. Anyway,
I don't think you'd be alone with people feeling the same way about sheep. To be fair, John, even the ones that like them still have that stress with them. We've already established, again, if you pardon the pun, that everything you do at the farm is about balance. You're not fully ploughing, you're not fully min-tilling. You've even got sort of periods of fallow here and there. So I can't say no till because you are still tilling them, but there's almost a mix of the three. Um, Certainly my perception, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it feels like organic farmers are moving with the inception of regenerative agriculture being the new quote unquote thing, moving towards reduced tillage as well as staying organic. Now that doesn't seem like a sort of something that you'd jump into in that you already done it before. But what do you think is making people make that change?
I think it's because we all understand that moving soil around is a thankless task generally in terms of purely soil health. It's not great. And I don't do as much field work as I used to, but I do a little bit. And especially and I did a little bit of ploughing this winter, and it's distressing, to be quite honest. I will defend it, as I have done earlier on in this chat we've been having, and I don't feel bad about doing it, because I know that we have to do it if we're not using herbicides. But turning that thing around back into a seed bed takes a huge amount of effort and resources and fossil fuels. And so we're all trying to look for a different way to do things. And I think that what's really exciting about the regenerative movement, and I have to say that, caveat that by saying, my system, being an organic system, having done it for 25 years, has to be regenerative by default, because otherwise, we wouldn't be still producing crops that yield and remain profitable. So we have to be regenerative. But the enthusiasm and the inventiveness and the innovation that is going on with regenerative farmers these days is phenomenal. And I think that organic farmers have really latched onto that and are learning a huge amount from people who are doing something, although still using some chemicals and trying to use less fertilizers, trying to do less tillage, is a really exciting thing. And I think that it's certainly made me feel, even though I've always been passionate about what I do, it's re-engaged me in areas that I haven't been engaged with before, and that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, it's got to be. And I think any movement forward in a positive manner, no matter where that is, sometimes that is aimless and wandering, thinking we're going forward because the science hasn't been done yet, or we haven't tried this, is a step in the right direction. And
Yeah.
learning that even if it's not successful is also a step in the right direction. If we were to look at almost like a myth busting thing type here, John, for want of a better term, is there any major misconceptions that some of the listeners might be thinking? They might have seen there's an episode to listen on tillage and organic farming. Is there anything that those people might be thinking that maybe isn't true, or maybe they're not thinking that is true?
Well, I think there is a misconception that people assume that organic farmers plough everything every year, which is just not. I don't know any organic farmer who does that. I think people worry about organics because of the standards. And so it's like a rigid set of standards. I wrote an article where I argued that actually I felt that having standards was the sort of the mother of invention. Because if somebody says you can't use any herbicides or any pesticides, you have to really put your thinking hat on to work out how it's going to work. And it's taken me 25 years to get, I still have no idea what I'm doing. But but what it does is it forces you into a situation of invention. Now, in the regenerative world, and I'm going to caveat this by saying I'm a massive fan of what's happening at the moment, is that if you always have something to go back to, it just stops you from progressing. I think to a certain extent, it's like in a funny kind of a way, even though I understand why people want to use glyphosate, if it was banned or people could use it, just imagine the innovation that will come out of that. Farmers are amazing. And even in my lifetime, all the things that have been thrown at us during my working lifetime, lots of massive changes in farming at every single time, collectively as an industry and as farmers sharing knowledge at a farm level, we managed to bust these problems. And I think having a set of standards really forces you into that situation. But having said that, with the regenerative movement, and I know we've touched on this before, but any system that tries to lessen things that damage our ecosystems are has got to be welcomed.
Oh, surely, surely. It'd be
Yeah.
quite interesting just to hear. You mentioned some of the big changes, the big challenges that we've sort of overcome. What are the ones that spring to mind that have impacted your farm, John?
Well, I suppose that when I first started, first of all, when I first started, we used to burn everything. After harvest, we used to, there was a joke that, our baler was made by Bryant and May, a box of matches. And so we just literally burn everything. And the stubble, was burnt, and the heat sort of slightly lifted the soil into this sort of friable condition. And we used to literally go with scratch with the cultivator, produces the most amazing seed bed, incredibly easy. I mean, I know why it was banned, and God knows what it did to the microbes in the soil. And anyway, certainly burnt off a load of blackgrass weed seeds. And then, of course, that was banned. And then we had to work out, oh my God, because we had all the kit to do nothing, and suddenly we had to work out how we were going to deal with all this straw. And so that was a big challenge. The other big challenge for me in my farming lifetime is when I came to work on the farm, we had 13 men on the farm, we had 1,000 acres. We had 13 men with 13 tractors, lots of small tractors, 13 guys on the farm, just couldn't afford to, even before we went organic, we had to change our system. So we're now farming, I don't know, 4,500 acres, 5,000 acres with three full-time people on the arable side. It's insane. So the changes that you have to go through as a business, losing people, which is really distressing because there's fewer people on the farm, but working out how to do the same job with bigger machinery and with less people and with different machinery, that's a real challenge. But the biggest one was going organic. That was the biggest challenge, because that was a complete relearning of everything that I'd learned at college. I did all the spraying on the farm. I was on the basis professional register. I was a fully trained agronomist. And then to turn that around and just say, I've got to work out how I do this without getting all the answers from the can. That was the biggest challenge. And as I said, and I'm not joking, I still haven't got it right. I'm still learning. I don't think we ever get it right, but I'm on a journey, and I'm still feeling really enthusiastic about that journey. But they're the biggest changes, I would have said.
Right is an absolute, and I think if you decide, oh, I'm there, then you stop progressing, you stop innovating, don't you? So I'm sure you're in a better place than you were 26 years ago. Yeah, you might not be perfect, but it would be fair to assume that not many are. We've mentioned soil health a bit, John.
Yeah.
When we're sort of looking at tillage, is there any, how would you say this, any specific strategies, I guess, that you look to use to reduce any negative effects that tillage might have on soil health?
Yeah. So about soil health, I might sort of just sort of frame this. And then before we converted, the year before we converted, we did a load of baselines in terms of biodiversity, but also in soils. And just thinking about, and this is a contentious subject because depending on what test you use, and actually the fluidity of the whole thing in terms of carbon and soil organic matter. But anyway, whatever the arguments are, we've been using this same test over the last 25 years, which is the loss on ignition test, which I know is not great, but it is what it is. And before we converted, we were 2.9% soil organic matter. We're now 5.5%. And then actually we've had some recent tests back in the last year that pushing us up towards 6%. In terms of soil organic matter, we're still building it. I think because we're tilling, probably 6.5 is the maximum we get to. But the whole point is really trying to understand about what you have to do when you damage soils. And I'm going to say the word damage, sounds very negative, but it's true. Certainly, I believe that the leys in a farming system, whether you're grazing animals on it or you're getting paid by the government to, increase soil health, or so, pollinators growing legumes and pollinators, I think is pretty key. I mean, farming systems for time immemorial have used leys and fallows to improve soil health and allow you to then grow cash crops. And the only reason why we've stopped doing it is because of ammonium nitrate and herbicides to a certain extent. But certainly artificial fertilizers have allowed us not to do that. Using cover crops, and people say that on our heavy land, and they're only in for a short space of time, are they actually doing very much? Well, I believe that they have two roles here. One is to capture some carbon and to get some living roots in the soil when there wouldn't normally be any in the soil. But for us as well, if you've got a nice dense cover crop, it also helps us suppress weeds as well. I think that, those two things are probably the biggest thing, the leys being the most important, and then doing the appropriate tillage at any one time and not over tilling. And generally, we undertill and put on a higher seed rate to have a slightly cloddier seed bed to leave it more open. And so we tend to undertill anyway, but just put the seed rate up. And my feeling is that you only get one chance to put seed in the ground. And with an interrow hoe or a harrow comb, we can take some plants out, but you can't stitch them back in again after you drill them. But to answer your question, I just think that, we've been, as an industry, since livestock left our farms and since we've been using ammonium nitrate, we've been burning off carbon built up by generations of farmers before us through the use of animals and leys. And I don't believe it's sustainable. I think in some way, and even without our sheep, we'll still have a 12-month lay. It's really 18 months because it's undersown in the previous crop. And I just think it's incredibly important.
You mentioned a wee bit there about you undertill, and also earlier on in the episode we've sort of spoke about the concept of, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, that sometimes you'll plough, sometimes there'll be min-till, sometimes there'll be that fallow period for however long that might be. How do you determine the depth from a tillage perspective when you are tilling, and also the frequency of those cultivations?
Depth is really we basically till as shallow as we can. Depth really is looking at, for us, it's about weeds, to be honest. So we will only deep till if we've got some rhizomes to get under. So with creeping thistle. So what we do is we go out in the field and we'll dig up the creeping thistle, find out exactly, and we how deep that lateral rhizome is, and then we'll just cut just underneath that to try and first of all uproot it, but also cut off the energy source as well. Same with couch grass to a certain extent, but couch grass is generally, the rhizomes are very shallow, and so that's not so much of a problem. But the depth really is down to weed species. It's also down to, nobody's perfect and no one year is the same, but there will be years when we are tilling or operating on our fields where conditions aren't absolutely ideal. That's just the nature of the game, especially on a a clay soil. And so if we have to do any remedial action, as in subsoil or plough, or use we've got a disc tines disc press arrangement. It's got a set of tines in the middle, and we gauge how deep we put those on, depending on, actually, we have got a small pan to bust through. And that was the other thing with the sheep, to be quite honest as well, is even with the back fencing, we would get a shallow pan in some places, in some fields, because we'd you had the sheep on the ground when they shouldn't have been there, or they'd been there too long. I think I've answered the question in the way that actually it's a many faceted thing. You just go in there and dig holes and work out what you're trying to do. Is what we do. And actually, everyone, after two very difficult years, the last 2 years, because we had two very wet winters, as everyone has, is that now everyone has a fork attached to their tractor. And whenever it doesn't matter if even when they're chilling or doing whatever they're doing, is that when they look around their machine, when they're getting off their tractor and they're checking it every hour to check that everything's looking as it should do, is to get that fork out and just dig around in the soil and make sure that you're doing the job that you think you're doing.
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to focus everybody's eyes on the detail in terms of what we should be doing in terms of tillage and how to minimize that in every circumstance if possible.
I think that comes down to, like you were saying earlier, right at the start, you spoke about diversity in many forms, one of which was drilling date. And that comes in with, so many things in farming, be that arable side, be that sheep, be that whatever, that happens on today's March 12th. So let's say March 12th, that happens on March 12th, that happens on whatever. And I think it's even that thing of what you're saying there, John, just getting out with the fork, having a look. It's learning what you're doing. It's not just, well, it happens then. And I think that's
Yeah,
really valuable.
I agree.
Much more important than probably noticed to most people. So yeah, completely on board with that. You mentioned there just previous there, John, about organic matter creeping up to 6%, which is brilliant. What impact on sort of soil structure and biology as well have you seen over time in the organic system?
Well, I'm going to hold my hands up here. This is why I'm very glad that I've got one of my um, children, young people, whatever they call these days, coming back on the farm. Because actually, what I tried to do was develop a system. I've been just trying to get on top of the system for 25 years to make sure that it's successful and it's profitable. But the thing that I haven't really been doing, this is where the regenerative agriculture and that whole thing comes in, and going to Groundswell and going to hear all those wonderful speakers, is that we need to be, I need to be doing, but certainly I'm really encouraging the younger people on the farm to really engage with the detail on soil biology, and actually and all the things that people are trying to encourage us to use in terms of soil amendments and all the things that people are selling now, that were never around when we first converted. And I was really on that input treadmill, and it took me about 5 years to realize what a wonderful thing it was to get off it. And I've been sort of slightly resisting, and I know this is only about soil amendments and biostimulants and so on and so on, inoculants, whatever you're going to put on. Is I've sort of resisted it because I just don't want to get back on that treadmill. I've been trying to build a system that actually uses as few resources as possible. But I really do need to focus more on the biology of our soils. And we had a soils day here, and I'm sure you've interviewed him with Niels Caulfield, who is sort of in that space. And we need to be engaging with more people like Niels, but actually really understanding the changes that have been happening rather than just thinking something's happening, really understanding it, making sure that we're going forward in a positive direction. So no, I'm lacking on that. I have to say, and we need to refocus.
Niels and I have cancelled on each other 3 times on my own podcast, so we haven't actually. But it's definitely in the pipeline. Fascinating guy, to be honest.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
great. He's great.
We said earlier that it's hard to be green when you're in the red, and I think in reality that's the case across the board. Yeah, we can sort of take an economic hit for the quote unquote greater good here and there, but across the board that's not possible. So you said earlier about the difference in prices in 1999. Yes, there's a sort of lower yield, but over the course you were putting less chemical on, so less cost, and you were getting over double the price for what you were paid for your crop. How does that compare today, John?
I think it's pretty similar, to be quite honest. I mean, organic prices, a rule of thumb is that they're either double or they are £100 a ton above the conventional price. That's a rule of thumb, I would say, certainly with cereals. With pulses, that's slightly different. I'm just talking about basic combinable crops here.
Yeah.
So it's wheat, barley, beans, oats, which are I suppose are our staples. And beans can be 450, £500 a ton, but so they can be inflated in a non-organic situation. So I think that's the rule of thumb. We usually budget on that sort of kind of level, and it's pretty much where it is. And in terms of yield, I would say that generally it depends on the crop. So winter wheat, I would say that we are probably a third less than a conventional yield. In oats and spring oats and spring barley, probably slightly better than that, probably a little bit better than that. And beans, depending on if they get disease or not, can be quite similar to a non-organic yield. But I would say generally, if you had a rule of thumb, you'd say basically across our rotation with those combinable crops, we're probably a third less
Right.
in terms of yield. But then lots of the novel crops we're growing, like lentils or chia or quinoa, quinoa, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, yields can be relatively similar depending on the crop. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, really.
I must say, I'd never heard quinoa until about 3 years ago. It was only quinoa, and then suddenly there was a new word for it. I prefer the
I
word.
know.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, yeah.
Let's even focus a wee bit more. Let's take two organic systems, one of which is tillage based, pretty conventional on that side of things, but compared to a no or very minimum till system, are the economics pretty equal in that?
Well, because we do such a range of them all, I can't really tell you that ours is so diverse. We're not comparing. I mean, we're doing the best thing, the thing that we think is the right thing to do in any field in any year. And so I haven't really compared greater tillage. Generally, it happens like this: is that after our lay, we use our Gregoire Besson Discadon, which is the disc time disc press thing to break the legs. We want to keep all that stuff mixed in the top 4 inches of soil rather than shoving it down the bottom of the furrow. And then generally after that, we would after is the wheat crop, we would generally sort of put a duck's foot cultivator through that soil, put a green manure with a seeder on the back of that, and then that would be left over winter and then lightly cultivated pre-drilling. Pre-beans, we would normally plough because beans generally, in my experience, yields better if they have a looser soil. And also the other thing is because we want to drill them later, we want to weatherproof the soil. And certainly if you're ploughing straight after harvest, it usually dries out and it will take a lot of rain before you can't get back on it again. So I can't really, the only thing I would say is that, and I don't know if you've come across him, but he's a really interesting business focused organic farmer called John Baker Creswell up in Northumberland. And he does plough everything every year because he has done these comparisons and he knows on his soils in Northumberland, he gets a much better yield if he does that. I don't know about his soils. John's a very bright guy. And I'm sure you need to talk to him. He's a really inventive guy. And I suppose the easiest thing every single year would be to plough, but I just think it would be too damaging. And it's not something I want to do.
There must be something about Johns that know a lot about this. I think this, I think the thing with these podcasts is we have 45 minutes to an hour, we chat for that, and that's fine. But it's hard to add in that sixth principle, as we spoke about in the last episode, of context,
Yeah.
because we don't have 25 years. We have
No.
this hour to chat, and I think that's why I'm maybe guilty of my questions being somewhat, not blanket, but trying to be somewhat all encompassing, just because of the time we have to chat. And I guess on that, John, as we sort of draw the episode to a close, if you've got someone listening today, that's maybe they're maybe organic and they're not fully sure how to run their system with a focus on tillage, what would your advice be to them while trying to maintain both productivity and soil health?
It's got to be farm trials, really. I mean, we haven't done lots of trials, comparative trials on tillage, I have to say. But in terms of understanding how agronomically you can build resilience into a system, doing lots of trials is really key. I think the other bit of advice I would give, especially if you're at the beginning of a journey, is that usually the problem isn't your soil. Usually the problem is you, is that you haven't switched your head into a different system. And certainly my first 10 years, I was still farming organically, very much like a conventional farmer, and made a lot of mistakes. And so I think it's about really engaging with people who are trying to do something similar, seeing as many people as possible. And I know that, everyone talks about it now, and I didn't go to the first one, but I certainly went to the second one. But Groundswell and the Cherry family, in my mind, the sort of the savior of not only regenerative, but I would argue organic farming systems, because that whole event and that whole family has done so much for this way of farming. It's almost unbelievable. So engage with people like that.
I haven't been, but I am going this year, and I'm pretty excited for it, actually.
Well, listen, when you come, we always camp, and so we must have a beer.
100%. That sounds like a cheer. If this podcast has done anything, then that's got to be a win out of it. I think you mentioned something really good, and just the last couple of sentences you said there, John, and what I took from it was, it's quite easy to look at organic farming as conventional without chemical, and it's not that simple. There's much more facets to it, as we've said a few times. But
yeah. Can I just say, I think it's so important. I mean, you can go around a lot of organic farms that don't look very organic, just as you can go around a lot of regenerative farms that don't look very regenerative. And that's, you've got to be honest. If it's not looking very organic or it's not looking very regenerative, you've got some changes to make.
John, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm so flattered that you asked me, and I've loved talking to you.
Well, it's been a joy. I've learned a lot. I'm sure those of you listening have as well. And as always, and has been the case for the last 5 episodes, thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. Do get in touch with Agricology if you have any questions for us. That has been John Pawsey, and if you want to listen to the episode just before this, we had Julia Cooper on, dialed in from Canada, speaking about the science side of tillage. So thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you for the next one. thank you very much for following the To Till or Not to Till series. See you later.